Thank you. My name is Ross Thorn. So Stamen started a podcast last year, and I want to share some insights and reflections in starting this podcast. But first, I'm going to just share a little bit more about me. My mom says I need to put myself out there more and be a bit more social. So here's just like two truths and one lie. It's just, pretty basic, uninteresting stuff. I'm an avid podcast listener. I've placed in a dancing competition. I've buried a non-zero amount of human bodies. And so the obvious lie, I'm not an avid podcast listener. I don't actually love podcasts. I listen to a few sometimes, and there's a handful that I draw inspiration from that I'll talk a little bit about, but sometimes you're just the person who's got the best recording setup at your company. For legal reasons, I had to blur that. I might have stepped on something. Right, yeah. As a disclaimer for number 3, it's just what happens when your dad owns excavating equipment in a small town and is a gravedigger. So, yeah, thank you. I'm legally not allowed to talk about that one. If you were at Norfolk in 2018, maybe you saw me dancing a little bit. Okay, with all my good jokes out of the way, we'll go on. In December of 2021, we launched a podcast at Stamen called Pollinate. We released our 11th episode, and we'll be wrapping up season 1 in December. It's spelled PLN8. It's pronounced pollinate, or is it planet? That's one of the unsung lessons, that if you try to attempt to make your podcast seem cooler by dropping vowels and adding a number, and your team has too much faith in you to tell you that that's a bad idea, you're going to be explaining how to pronounce your podcast to people. But out of all the name ideas, this is the one that looks best on a mug, so there's that. I'll share a little bit about how we did ours, so a little insight into the process, how to do podcasting a little bit, some ideation, some equipment, logistics, and strategy, but then also just how you talk about maps, and what we found works for us when doing a podcast about them. So starting with the podcast idea, what do you want to talk about? What do you want your position to be? Is there some sort of niche that you can find? Is it going to be, more than just 3 mediocre white men riffing on each other? And you don't have to be 100% original, because not much actually is, but, if you're hoping to grow and make some sort of splash in the endless sea of podcasts that are out there, it's worth it to come at this with some thought. And so what we really wanted to set out a space for, us to talk about the work we do. And so this is sort of like that cornerstone of it, as a podcast about data, design, and the people that bring them to life. And so we do a lot of work with maps, data visualizations, and designs, but to me and many of us, it's really the people behind all of those projects that we really like. And like in school, English class, I loved learning about the authors and the context with when a story was written. That really helped me understand and appreciate it. So in the podcast realm, I do listen to some podcasts, but those like Song Exploder are an inspiration to me, where musicians sort of tell the stories behind a song, talking about their life and their influences as well. So that's just sort of what we wanted to do with cartography, data viz, and design. I'm going to just briefly cover some equipment, what we use. It's not going to be like why we use this and not this. There's tons of stuff out there. So you can find out what works for you, what works best. So for recording, I have a really nice Shure mic running through a Focusrite interface. Super nice, overkill. You don't need that. We also have an AT 2020 mic that is more of a USB. It's still really good. So you can't really control the audio for your guests as well. We record remotely entirely. So and we use that. We use Riverside. A digital studio is sort of a video call that allows us to record each participant separately on their local machine, so nothing gets compressed going through the internet, trying to fit in all those tubes. You know how the internet works. I do too. We don't need to go into that. But those individual tracks are really crucial for editing, and it makes it super easy. I use Ableton, a digital audio workstation intended for music. Where's my mouse? There we go. You scroll. But kind of editing the conversation on a macro level, like clipping out ums and uhs and breaths and just making it smoother. I can also balance levels, so people with lower voices and people with higher voices, kind of making them sound the same, and despite their recording setup. I also use Adobe Audition, which comes in with Creative Cloud, and this is sort of, I can scrub frequencies on more of a micro level, so if there's like a bump or a pop, you know, all that stuff, I can isolate those frequencies and take them out of there really nicely. And then we use Anchor to distribute as a one-stop shop. You just upload it and can pick whatever you want it to get to, Apple, Spotify, and it's just super easy. It gives us metrics as well for how we're doing. And so once we do our release, we try to promote it. Stamen was pretty well established before I came to work with them, so as a podcast producer, it was pretty spoiled. But regardless of your situation, if you're doing a podcast, you want people to listen to it, you're going to have to promote it in some way. So we release, with every release, we grab a quote that's sort of like an ear-catching and eye-catching video and snippet from there that kind of like sums up what's going to be talked about, or like a really cool nugget of wisdom. And so we post these to our social media. This is Instagram and Twitter as well, so you can find those. And for frequency, it's a huge, that plays an important role in the growth. So how often and how consistent you release will dictate a fair amount of your growth. And yeah, consistency is the key. This is one of the most prevalent pieces of advice that I had found out there. Regularly releasing episodes is the best way to build an audience, so kind of you have to figure out what is realistic for you. For me, I thought doing a bi-weekly would be good, and then at the last minute, we sort of erred on the side of caution, pulled it back, and let's do monthly, and I feel so much better about that. It's really helped. So, you know, in the end, it's better to be reliable than it is to be fast. It's something I told all of my coaches growing up, and they're like, Ross, you're neither, and I was like, oh, okay. So kind of tied in with that, you start slow, gauge how consistent you can be. It leads to a slower growth, that's the downside of that, but it's growth nonetheless that you can actually measure. And so you've got your ideas, the setup, strategy, and all that stuff, but how do you talk about maps? And it sounds easy. Many of us are educated in cartography or geography. We're all here listening to people talk about maps, so it can't be that hard. So for instance, we'll talk about this particular map. I love this map. The labels really pop. You know, the colors are striking. The water is gorgeous and really sets a good tone. Yeah, there's no map. You got it. You got it. My plant worked perfectly. There's an obvious problem with that. Talking about maps that your audience can't see is really a challenge. And can you do it in a meaningful way? Sort of like the strange conundrum in a novel issue of using an audio format to talk about a visual medium. But I think it can work, and we're trying our best and trying different things. So, especially if we use detail when we talk about it. It starts during the conversation, or even before that if you're preparing, and taking a page out of the book of accessibility. You know, we're almost like creating some alt text in our conversations for these visuals that we're talking about. You know, my description actually kind of sucked, I'll be honest. Labels really pop, colors are striking. Like, it doesn't really tell you much. They're decent when you're both looking at a map and, you know, it can serve as something, but, you know, it's best to assume that your audience is not looking at the same thing and they're doing something else. So I'm constantly practicing and improving. So here we go. The labels use a sleek sans serif font with a feathered halo. The dark color of the text contrasts well with the soft features below. So it's definitely more verbose, but it sounded so much better, am I right? But terms like sleek sans serif and feathered halo, you know, it starts pulling you in a bit more. Maybe a user was inspired by Lauren Tierney's talk yesterday. and wanting to try a cool Halo solution. So if you comment on something like that, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I've been wanting to do something. And sometimes your audience is not super mappy as well. So, sometimes they are. Sometimes it's your mom telling you that most things went over her head in that last episode, but you're doing great, honey. So just keep in mind everyone listening and just be empathetic to your audience. So be descriptive, use detail. But the thing is, visualizations are still key. This isn't necessarily a part of podcasting, but providing supplementary works to support your podcast can really go a long way. So Stamen has a blog where we have an accompanying post for every episode. You can see the episode from last week right there. It was one of my favorite episodes. Go check it out. Won't go too much into the details, but you can see the person is definitely a focus for us, still remaining kind of with our cornerstone statement. But we also include the core visuals we talk about in the episode, and link to them in the link to the blog post in every episode that we publish. So we are constantly reminding listeners in the conversation to go check out what we're talking about too. So supplementing with visuals is pretty imperative, but also be mindful, as we're talking about accessibility too, that some people might be hard of hearing or really just prefer to read conversations. So we include a transcript as well. It's another step, and sometimes it's a paid thing to do, but I think it's worth it in the end. So when we talk about maps, when we can't see them, important to remember to be descriptive, and with that be empathetic, and also provide visuals that are easy for your audience to find in some way. So I'm going to tie this back a little bit of what we've talked about at Stamen in some of our episodes, some cool themes, and maybe what's coming down the pipeline. Here's that cornerstone statement again, and what I really liked about this is it's specific enough to point to the kind of work that we do, but also gives us the breadth in the fields that we play in. And so here are some of the episode topics and projects that we've discussed. Maps of emotion, maps of places that are disappearing due to climate change. How do you define a base map? Data equity. How do you map things that are invisible? How do you map census data taken over 100 years ago? So these are the raw topics and the raw projects, but there are some really cool themes and through lines with all of them that speak to us as a collective. And these are things like power structures are ever present in these conversations, and a huge theme in mapping and data visualization anyways. So we try to touch on that and pull those out of the topics that we're discussing. But communication, empathy, challenging the way that we think about things, redefining what is a map, because that's never been done before, These all come up in beautiful stories of self-discovery that our guests share with their inspirations, and we're hoping to continue this with the other topics we explore with more creators. We also discuss outside of mapping, which is, as a cartographer, is really cool because many of these themes kind of translate back and forth between these fields. So if you can talk to folks that have some intersecting interest, but not a complete overlap, you're really setting yourself up to be enriched through the process. So I'd love it if you gave it a listen. Here are the QR codes for Spotify and Apple. We're on more. Just look us up on your favorite podcast platform, and thank you very much.